So how can we prevent that users can visit /recipes if they are not authenticated? Do you remember the routing section? There we had a look at route guards, and that is exactly what we need here. A route guard allows us to run logic right before a route is loaded, and we can deny access if a certain condition is not met. And this is exactly what we need here. For that, in the auth folder, let's create a new file, and I'll name it auth.guard.ts, and that will be my, well, as the name suggests, authentication guard. And in there, let's export a class, authGuard, which should implement the canActivate interface. Now this is imported, not from this path, but from @Angular/router. And since this technically is a service, and of course you could name it export class authGuard service therefore, since this is a service, we need @injectable here. Whoops, injectable, like this, which is imported from @AngularCore. And here you can use provided in root to provide this application wide if you want. Again, you could also add it to providers in the app module. So that is the authGuard. Since we add the canActivate interface here, we now have to add the canActivate method. The canActivate method has to be implemented in a certain way. It receives the currently active route, which is of type activated route snapshot. And you can, by the way, see this if you press Command or Control and click on the interface. Then you can see the definition here. So we get two arguments, the activated route snapshot and the router state snapshot. So that's the second thing here, router state snapshot, both imported from @AngularRouter. And canActivate then has to return either a Boolean or a promise that eventually yields a Boolean, expressed here by using this generic promise notation, or an observable, which eventually will yield a Boolean. And for that, you also need to import observable from RxJS. This is how canActivate should look like. And right now we're getting an error because we are not returning anything when we are expected to return a Boolean, a promise, or an observable. Now, what can we return here? We want to return the status as we can derive it from our auth service. So here, let's inject the auth service, which is of type auth service, and which you need to import from the auth service file. And then in there, we can find out whether the user is authenticated or not by looking at that user behavior subject. So here we can access this auth service user, and now don't subscribe here, but return it instead, because this already is an observable. It's a subject and therefore also an observable. However, not an observable that returns a Boolean. Instead, it is an observable that in the end returns a user object. But this can be fixed easily. We just add pipe and use the map operator, which is imported from RxJS operators, to transform the observable value here. So we get our user, and we want to return true or false, so we can simply return !! user, which is that trick which converts a true-ish value, like an object, so anything that is not null or undefined, to true, so to a real Boolean, or that converts a false-ish value, like null or undefined, to a true Boolean, so to false in this case. So now we have an observable that really will return true or false, and that should allow us to use that activate guard in front of the routes that we want to protect. So now with canActivate added here, let's go to the app routing module. And here, of course, it's this path here, the recipes path, which I want to protect. So in there, we can add the canActivate key, which is an array of all the canActivate guards you want to register for this route. And here it's only one route, it's the auth, only one guard, it's the auth guard, which you also need to import, of course. With that changed, let's save that and let's see if it works. That doesn't look too bad. We are kind of stranded here, and we should take care about that, but at least we can't access /recipes. Though, is this really the right behavior? Let's have a look at application. This is empty, so let's try logging in now, like this. And we can visit recipes. So here we are granted access. This is looking good. And now let's reload the recipes page. And this also works. So indeed, this works and it gives us the right data. The guard works correctly here. What we should make sure though is that when we log out and we manually try to go to /recipes, that we actually redirect the user to a page where he can do something like the authenticate page. And to do that, we can go back to the guard. In there, we are returning true or false. But now if we have a closer look at the can activate interface by command or control clicking on it, we see we can actually return more than just observables or promises or booleans. We can also return a URL tree or a promise or an observable that yields a URL tree. This is a relatively new feature, and it was added basically for this exact use case for authentication. It was added so that you can redirect users when the URL they're trying to visit is blocked. So for can activate, for this guard, which you often use in connection with authentication, you have now a more convenient way of redirecting users. In the past, with older Angular versions, you had to manually redirect. So for example, here, you would have added a tab, RxJS operator, which you need to import, by the way. And there you would get that is auth information because map gives us true or false, is the user authenticated or not. And then here you could check if not is auth, you know, okay, I don't want to grant access. Then you would inject the router like this from @Angular router, of course. And with the router injected in here, you would call this router navigate and go to /auth, for example. And this works. If I save that and the app reloads, you see, if I type recipes here, I automatically go to auth. Nothing wrong with this. But in some edge cases, this could lead to race conditions with multiple redirects that kind of interfere with each other. And therefore, instead of using this approach, you can now also use a different one and not return true or false here, but return true if you want to grant access, but not false otherwise, but this URL tree. So here I'll store the result of my conversion here in isAuth. And if we have isAuth, so if this is trueish, then I will just return true. Otherwise, I want to return a URL tree. And now such a URL tree can be created with the router, which you still need to inject therefore. But there you can now call create URL tree. And there you can simply pass in your normal array of segments, of route segments you want to navigate to. So for example, /auth. I'm getting an error here because the types I added here don't include the URL tree. We just need to update this to meet the specification of the interface. And yes, a URL tree is allowed there. You just need to import that type from @Angular router. And then it is fine to return an observable that either yields a boolean or an URL tree. The same for a promise, and also instead of a normal boolean. So returning a URL tree or promises or observables that yield URL trees are okay. We're doing that here. And therefore now if we save that, we get the same behavior as before. If I visit /recipes, I'm forwarded to auth. If I just try to load localhost 4200, we also go to auth, because if we just try to load the page as it is there, first of all, we get redirected to recipes, but there we then have the guard, which then continues redirecting us to auth. So now we have a auth guard in place that should do its job and that makes sure that we really can only reach the recipes page if we are logged in. But there we can reach it without issues, even if we reload the app, because we're using auto login, but also auto log out to clear everything once our token expired. Now with that, we're almost done with the guard, but there's one thing I want to edit in this auth guard. Right now, we're subscribing to our user service here. We're mapping that value into true or false, and we are returning a URL tree if it is false, and if we want to redirect. The one issue we have here is that we essentially set up an ongoing subscription here, though. This user subject, of course, can emit data more than once, and I don't want that here. This can lead to strange side effects if our guard keeps on listening to that subject. Instead, we want to look into that user value for one time only and then not care about it anymore unless we run the guard again. And therefore here, just as in other places too, we should use take one to make sure that we always just take the latest user value and then unsubscribe for discard execution, so that we don't have an ongoing listener to that, which we really don't need. And therefore here you need to import the take operator, the take RxJS operator, and add it here in front of map so that we don't have an ongoing user subscription. With that, if you save that, you see I can still visit recipes here after reloading, so the guard generally still seems to work. But now if I log out and I try to access recipes, we fail, as we should. If I now log in again, we succeed. So the guard now still works as before, but now we avoid nasty bugs which could occur due to us rerunning the logic in the guard when we really don't want to rerun it. That's it for authentication. In this module, we added an auth service to our Angular application to manage the entire front-end authentication logic we need. That includes signing user up and signing the user in based on the inputs in that form here. It also includes things like switching between sign up and sign in, showing error messages, and storing a token that we then get after a successful login. We're also storing the token such that it persists once we reload the page. And we can also use that token to then fetch data and save data from our now protected Firebase backend. Again, as I stressed throughout this module already, Firebase is just one example here. The general logic of how you exchange tokens always is the same. Now, you also learned that there is more to managing the token than just logging in and getting a token. You don't just want to store it in memory, you want to store it in a place that survives browser reloads. And you want to make sure that it is cleared once it did expire. We also used a routing guard, to protect a route against unauthenticated access, our recipes area in this case, with help of the auth service and the logic we have in there. Last but not least, we made sure that the header is updated correctly based on our authentication status, which in turn is derived from our auth service and the user we're storing there in this behavior subject. Behavior subject because unlike a normal subject, this always gives us access to the previous value, and that simply helps us ensure that we can get access to the user even if in this part of the application where we need it, we missed the previous user update. And that's it for authentication. I hope you learned a lot here and you now feel confident adding authentication to your applications as well. In this module, we'll have a look at components again, but now at dynamic components. Now, what are dynamic components? Dynamic components are essentially components which you create dynamically at runtime. So let's say you want to show an alert, you want to show a modal, some overlay, which should only be loaded upon a certain action. For example, you have an error and you want to not show that error box, which we're currently showing in our course project, but you want to show an overlay on the entire screen or something like that. That could be done or could be implemented by using dynamic components. And dynamic components is not a specific term, not a specific feature provided by Angular, but we can simply add components that we load through our code. And that's exactly what we'll do in this module. You will learn how to create such a component and how to then load it on demand, how to communicate with it, and also how to get rid of it.